Hello, and welcome to this lecture on Roman mythology. I want to talk a little bit about Roman mythology before I get into a discussion of the Aeneid, which is one of the major epics that we see coming from Rome. Having talked about the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Aeneid is one of those, it also talks about the Trojan War, but it talks about Rome's connection to the Trojan War. And also, when we look at Roman mythology, we see the 12 Olympians. We see them, but we see them in a different form. And the Roman system, of course, is the one that we remember the most. For example, the names of our planets come from the Roman and not from the Greek, even though the original associations of those planets come from the Greek. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. But for right now, let me share my screen. And let's talk about, let's jump ahead of me here. Let me go to here we are. Okay. Yeah, so this Roman mythology and Greek mythology are intimately connected. There are some differences in the way that they behave. So I always hate my bangs in these videos. I keep changing it around. And as we're going to see, the Roman view of myth, it's slightly different, and the Roman way of practicing religion has a tremendous amount to do with the way that we saw Christianity develop, the way that we saw Catholicism develop, the way that we understand religion now. A lot of that comes from the Roman way of understanding things, of understanding the gods and understanding religion itself. Now, as I've noted, normally the figures are alike. There is a story that's in, let me remind myself where it is. It's in one of the, I think it's in Livy's Annals. That's where it is. That's what I'm thinking of. Livy talks about the relationship between it talks about the way that the founders of Rome, or actually was it one of the founders? It wasn't one of the founders. It was one of the kings of Rome, one of the aristocratic kings of Rome. Actually made a decision when in coming in contact with the Greeks, because at first the Romans, it was said, admired Greeks for their theater. They admired the Greek tragedies, Greek comedies, and all the plays that they had developed. And Greek drama is a whole subject in and of itself, which we will talk about to some degree as we go along in the Greek in the course where we talk about Greek mythology. But we do see, and Rome did have their own ideas about things. And certainly the Roman background comes from the Etruscan. And not just the Etruscan, though. It's a bit of a misnomer to suggest that all of Roman culture comes from the Etruscans. It does have other inflections there, and and the original gods were associated more with local legend and didn't have that status of myth per se. But once they sort of acquired the Greek meanings of these, then then there became there at least became a cross connection between the two. So as I mentioned here in this slide, the Roman versions were written by Ovid. Ovid's Metamorphoses is the best collection. I am going to have in the list, in the bibliography for this class, and the list of whatever materials I can provide for you, I will mention Ovid's Metamorphoses. If you want to get a copy of it and look at it, it's very inexpensive. You can get the Penguin edition probably for less than $10 if you're in the US. And probably equally cheap in other places. Excuse me. But you have these are sort of your early writers. You have Varro, you have Virgil. Virgil, of course, we're going to be talking about the Aeneid. Although Virgil was sort of the, I guess you want to call him the poet laureate of the early empire. Although that was rather reluctant title that he held. He wasn't a man who liked a whole lot of attention. Propertius and Livy, of course. Livy is a good. Well, again, like Herodotus and like Thucydides, he's a historian of ancient Rome. But how much of what he's saying is actually factually true is something, we don't know. We don't know how much is legend and how much is truth. We have maybe some evidence, but that raises a whole other question. Pindar also, in his writings, and also I should mention probably Pliny, is another writer who certainly talks about the Roman and Egyptian crossover. We have sort of two distinct periods with the Romans. We have when we see Rome and Greece sort of coming together is during the era of the Second Punic War, which is about 218 to 201 BCE. And, when you see Rome, and at this time, Rome was still a republic. It was past being an aristocracy, past having a monarchy. And it was before they became an empire with a, emperor with absolute power. So in this period of time, they did a lot. They expanded their military. They did an awful lot to, the wars with Carthage, and the way that they had wars with various Celtic and Gaulish tribes, some of them which actually invaded Rome, and and the wars that they had certainly with the Macedonian Empire to the east. Rome eventually becomes, by the time of the empire, the major power in this area of the world, overshadowing, Greece, Persia, Macedonia, all of these other, rulers and empirical structures that had been in place before. So as they do so, one of the things that you find when you're getting to the period of where Julius Caesar is assassinated around 44 BCE, and then you're getting later than that into the period of Caesar Augustus, and then the era of Virgil and his writing of the Aeneid. You are looking at a time period in which there's a lot of what they call syncretism in Rome. So you see the influence, you see Judaic influence, you see the Bacchic cults, the cults of Dionysus, you see the Mithras cult, which is Persian. You see the influence of the mystery cults of Greece in that form coming over. You see the cults of Cybele and the Cappadonian goddess Ma, which brings this mother goddess worship into Rome. And it becomes a kind of, I don't want to say necessarily a conflict, but it starts to, all these things, when you have a diverse city like that, you start to see this kind of coming together of the traditional elements of the city with these outside elements. And, and again, it's kind of like, again, what we think of now is sort of New Age, or is in the way in which we might see Eastern beliefs and esoteric beliefs and certain beliefs within certain religious systems, like Jewish Kabbalah, for example, or the way certain forms of Christian mysticism might come together in a way that, and create something entirely new. You saw a lot of this. One of the texts, which I will note, is the Greek magical papyri, which is about, magical practices, but you see that they are a combination of Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, Roman, and so many different eras by the time, because Rome also at that point conquers Egypt as well. And Ptolemy becomes one of the rulers associated with the sort of Roman Egypt. So there's a whole lot of, you see the rise of the cult of Isis, and you see certain other things. And this all ends up being, part of this whole system. So, okay, so we're looking at this. So Rome ends up being a place where we see the birth of what we think of as modern Christianity, and we see this kind of coming together of how do I want to put it? Where you see this kind of a blending of beliefs and backgrounds, and then you start to have these ideas. For example, some of the early ideas about Jesus come out of this Roman system, and a lot of them are part of the syncretism. So you have ideas from Mithraism, you have ideas from Bacchus worship, you have all this kind of stuff, and and initially you see points in the Roman Republic where there's a bit of a conflict with these other belief systems coming in. In particular, there's the incident that happened in 186 BCE, where supposedly there was all this big trial around the cult of Bacchus. And in the cult of Bacchus, there's, they were talking about, they had all these outlandish things about, sexual activity, and perhaps murder and orgies and things that were against the more, what was a very actually, the Romans were always actually very moral in their whole religious system. And so they became very alarmed, and they not only expelled the Bacchic groups from Rome, but they also expelled the Jews and the philosophers at the same time. Because if you know anything about those histories, you know that these different ideas about religion and the ideas of these salvation cults and so forth came not only from the philosophers, but also from the Jews. Although later on, the Judaic way of religion, all the laws that are associated with Judaism, very much meshed actually with the Roman system, because the Romans had probably equally as many laws about, purity and ritual performance and things like that. So they actually ended up, even though the Romans considered the Jews to be atheists, because they didn't worship the emperor later on, there was kind of a, when Christianity, which was actually a sect of Judaism, ended up becoming the primary religion of the state, you saw all of those elements come together into what we think of as modern Christianity. So, or at least starting with medieval Christianity and developing as it did from there. Okay, anyway, I don't want to go too far into the history of religion. Let's talk about some of the Roman gods. So first, we're going to talk about Janus and Mars. Now, Janus is, or Ionos as it would have been in Latin, is a god of beginnings. Bridges, waterways. As you can see, Janus is a two-faced god. And there's another god that's similar to him, Portunus, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But, and you see other representations of Janus. We talked about this in the class on the liminal. Janus looks both ways. So he's looking towards the past and the future. So he's not, you don't see a middle image there, which is interesting. But there's this idea of one thing ending and another thing beginning. The month of January is named after Janus, okay? And he sort of has this sort of the ritual importance. I don't know that Janus was particularly widely celebrated, or that there were temples to Janus or anything like that, but certainly Janus is a figure who appears of some importance. Now Mars is interesting, because Mars we think of as being comparable to Ares, the god of war. Okay, we think of Mars as associated with war. But in addition to war, Mars is a god of agriculture. Okay, and Mars Ultor is the god of war. So I'm going to, there's something known as the archaic triad. We have the Capitoline triad and the archaic triad. And the archaic triad consisted of Jupiter, Mars, and a deity called Quirinus. Okay, and Jupiter is said to, when you read Georges Dumézil's work on the ancient Etruscans and on early Roman religion, he talks about Jupiter as representing physical power, Mars as representing bravery, and Quirinus as representing fertility or prosperity. Now later, both Mars and Quirinus would be replaced in the Capitoline triad with Minerva and Juno, and we'll talk about them in a moment. So I'm just going to read some notes that I have here. It says, Mars was supposed to have been dedicated, Mars Ultor in the Campus Martius, the area of Rome that took its name from him, was supposed to be even dedicated by King Numa. Now, King Numa is the one who supposedly admitted the Greek myths into Roman practice. Numa, the peace-loving, semi-legendary second king of Rome. Although the center of Mars worship was originally located outside the Pomerium, or sacred boundary of Rome, Augustus brought the god into the center of Roman religion by establishing the temple of Mars Ultor in his new form. Now that's not surprising, because Rome was very much a military state. So Mars in that particular aspect would be very important. Okay, so even though it says, although Ares was viewed primarily as a destructive and destabilizing force, Mars represented military power as a way to secure peace, the Pax Romana, right? And was a father of the Roman people. In the mythic genealogy and founding myths of Rome, Mars was the father of Romulus and Remus, who we'll also talk about, with Rhea Silvia, okay? Now notice Rhea, it's the same name that we have as the wife of Saturn, or Kronos in the Greek. His love affair with Venus symbolically reconciled the two different traditions of Rome's founding. Venus was the divine mother of the hero Aeneas. Now, Aeneas is going to be, as a Trojan hero, when we look at the Iliad and the Odyssey, we're talking about the Greek heroes. Here we have a look at the Aeneas survives the war, and he is one of the few who fought on the Trojan side who actually survived, and he has now become sort of the progenitor and he's associated with this founding of Rome. Even though Aeneas is not the founder of Rome itself, the Aeneid has to do with his coming into Italy and his destiny, his marriage and settling in Latium, which is where we get the word Latin from, in the Latin language. That was, Aeneas becomes kind of a grandfatherly figure to Rome, as it were. And of course, the Venus and Mars, as we had talked about, the Ares and Aphrodite relationship, it says it reconciles tradition. Venus was the divine mother of Aeneas, celebrated as the Trojan refugee who, quote unquote, founded Rome several generations before Romulus laid out the city walls. Mars was the son of Juno alone. Jupiter had usurped the mother's function when he gave birth to Minerva, or Athena, directly from his forehead. To restore the balance, Juno sought the advice of the goddess Flora on how to do the same. Flora obtained a magic flower, flossin or flores in Latin, which is a masculine word, by the way. And interestingly, flower is a masculine word in Latin. And tested it on a heifer who became fecund, or came with child at once. She then plucked a flower, ritually using her thumb, touched Juno's belly, and impregnated her. Juno withdrew to Thrace and the shores of Marmara for the birth. So Juno supposedly gives birth to Mars by herself. Juno is the equivalent of the Greek Hera. Virility is a kind of life force, or virtue is essentially characteristic of Mars. It's the idea of vir or vis, this life force. As an agricultural god, he directs his energies towards creating conditions that allows crops to grow, which may include warding off the hostile forces of nature. As an embodiment of a masculine aggression, he is the force that drives wars, but ideally, war that delivers a secure peace. Okay. And you see this theme in the Aeneid as well. Aeneas is kind of pushed into war, but he ends up engaging in war, and the idea is to secure peace. And as we talk about that, we'll see the differences between that and the Iliad, but not to digress into that point. The priesthood of the Arval brothers called on Mars to drive off rust, with the double meaning of wheat fungus and red oxides that affect metal, a threat to both iron farm implements and weaponry. And it's interesting because Mars is viewed as the red planet, and it contains largely iron oxide, which is rust on its surface. In the surviving text of their hymn, the Arval brothers invoke Mars as savage or feral, like a wild animal. And his potential for savagery is his connection with the woodlands and may have originated as a god of the wild beyond the boundaries set by humans. Cato invokes Mars Silvanus, which is Mars of the forests, for a ritual to be carried out in Silva in the woods, in an uncultivated place, not held within the bounds, can threaten to overtake the fields needed for crops. But again, we see Mars as a god of agriculture, but his role is primarily that of a protector. So we see that, again, we're starting to see initially what the differences are. So there was probably an original agricultural deity that maybe had a fierce nature that Mars and Ares ended up being conflated with when we talk about Mars. Okay, so now I mentioned the archaic triad of Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus. We see Mars and Quirinus being replaced here. Now we have Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. So now we have a male god and two female goddesses. Juno being the wife of Jupiter, so you can interpret those as Zeus and Hera, and Minerva is Athena. And they're worshipped in the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, which means, or Iupator Maximus, Optimus Maximus. There really is no letter J in Latin, just as there is, the letter V is pronounced like a W. That's why when Caesar says, Veni Vidi Vinci, I came, I saw, I conquered, it's really Veni Vidi Vinci, which sounds kind of mean, right? But it's just, but that is how it is. That is classical Latin versus what we think of now as church Latin. Just as a digression, my favorite part of church Latin, I remember learning when I took Latin in college, was Dr. Kelly saying to us, like the words for science, we think of comes from the word for knowledge, which is skio. Okay, skio, skiere, you know, what is the third principal part? I know skitus is the last one. I don't know if it's skivi, but in Church Latin, it's like, no, it's scio. So when you conjugate scio, normally it's OST, and then it's you know, it's let's see, I'm trying to think what it is. So it'd be skios, skeet, skeet, skimus, skintis, skint. Okay, that would be what it would be. That would be the principal part. So that would be I, singular you, he or she, or it, and then in the plural it would be we, you in the plural, or they. So you know, if it's so Church Latin wanted to make it an sh rather than like a hard c. So instead of skio, ski, skint, it would be shio, she, yeah, shit. And so they, of course, they immediately would switch back to skeet. You know, they switch back to the classical until we go, hey, wait a minute, that's not quite right. Anyway, just a little tidbit from what I learned in Latin. But some of the pronunciations that I have are from classical Latin, which would have been what was spoken. Church Latin comes much later. Okay, so you have this idea of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Now, what do we want to say about the relationship there? Well, if we think about Mars as having to do with bravery, Mars becomes replaced by Minerva. So, okay, remember we had talked about Ares as being the god of brute force and Athena being a goddess of war in terms of strategy. So yeah, so now you have the god who might, you know, if you're comparing him to Ares of brute force, being associated now more with just the idea of bravery, and in this case, you know, strategy, like cleverness in war, not just everybody running out there with their weapons. And if Quirinus was a deity, we don't know a lot about Quirinus, by the way, but if Quirinus was a guardian of the people, but also had to do with fertility and prosperity potentially, then we could see Juno as the wife of Jupiter, kind of filling that role as the mother, if you will, perhaps being associated. And Hera certainly was associated with civilization and proper marriage and all the things that are supposed to keep civilization going. So you could see where these two things would come together. And now Jupiter was central to Roman life, like Zeus in the Greek. And he's supposedly the one who gave King Numa the instructions for proper sacrifice to him. There's also this idea of the shield, or ankyle, that falls from heaven. Now, if you remember from the Iliad, there is a statue of Athena that falls from the sky in Troy called the Palladium. And that's because she's known as Pallas Athene. So it's the Palladium, and the Palladium is kept in the temple. Of course, the Greeks end up stealing the Palladium from the temple. Which is what causes Troy to eventually fall, because they said as long as the Palladium is there, Troy won't fall. Well, this is a very similar idea. There's this idea of this shield that is sent down. Jupiter throws this down to kind of indicate the sovereignty of Rome and, you know, their sort of right to be empire or right to be military conquerors. So it's interesting the way in which the shield, and when we think, you know, we think back about the shield of Achilles in the Iliad, we see the way in which the shield becomes, you know, it attains this kind of very heavy symbolism of authority and control. Okay, let's see, moving on. And here's an image of the Capitoline Triad. Now, one thing to notice here, so the question is, okay, which one is which? We all know, we can probably tell that the guy in the middle with the beard is probably Jupiter, right? But how else can we tell besides the fact that he has a beard? Well, if you look bottom, you can see the three animals. And as we have indicated about these, you know, what we have learned about the 12 Olympians and their associations, this ought to teach us something here. So who's the one on the left? Well, the owl on the bottom ought to give you away that that's Minerva, because Minerva, like Athena, is associated with the owl. In the middle, we have Jupiter, and you see the eagle, just as Zeus was associated with the eagle. And finally, on the right, you have Juno, which is like Hera, is associated with the peacock. Remember, we said she was associated with the peacock and the cow as Hera in the Greek. So you see that there. So oftentimes when you see these kinds of things, what really tells you the differences between these deities, who may in many ways just look alike, And as they've mentioned, many of these statues would have been colored in the past. Right now, everything's been drained out. That's why everyone thinks all these deities were, that all deities in Greece and Rome were just white because, because the color that they were painted with eventually disappeared with time. But they probably would have been colorful at that time. So yeah, so we see these three animals indicating to you which of the deities you are looking at. Okay, so we're going to go sort of elementally, and I want to look at the deities that have to do with these different areas. Okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Roman religion here too. Okay, so Vesta, Vulcan, and Cacus were the Roman deities of fire. Let me move this here so you can see. Okay. So they all have to do with fire. Vesta, of course, being more to do with the fire of the home and the hearth. And she was more connected with the household gods and the running of the household. And the fires of Vesta, especially the sacred fires for the whole community, were extremely important because if that fire goes out, then that can be the destruction of the city and its whole civilized, so this is civilized fire. This is fire that is used to warm your house, to cook your food, to do things like that. Vulcan, of course, has to do more with volcanoes. He's more destructive. And yeah, and the Penates, the household spirits, or the household gods, and Laris and the Penates really are associated with Vesta. And these are very akin to the tutelary spirits, the ones that have to do with the forces of earth, just the forces of life and of getting on with life, natural forces, okay? And each family was said to have their own Laris and Penates. And then there were Laris, they were really, well, they called them genius, or genius, as we would say. Is also, there's sort of the spirit of the family and then the spirit of the Roman people, the genii Romani populi, the spirit of the Roman people. And, and it was very important. These were, the term for these in occult thinking is egregores. They're the beings or the spirits that are associated with that community. And there's an agreement. So there's a way in which you feed and treat and act towards those deities in order to get, in order for them to protect and to bring prosperity to your community. Okay. So Vulcan, like Hephaestus, is associated with fire and also serves the same function. We'll see in the Aeneid. The Aeneid, in some ways, is a reflection of what we see in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And one of the things Vulcan does is create armor for Aeneas in the Aeneid. So he is definitely very much related to Hephaestus. And Cacus is an ancient deity of fire, and he's actually not considered to be very nice. I should note that a lot of the fire deities, except for Vesta, tend to be worshipped on the outskirts of the community. So if there was going to be a festival, or if there was going to be a sacrifice or a celebration, it would be on the outside. They didn't want to. You don't want a fire deity appearing in the middle, because you don't want your house to catch on fire. You don't want your temples to catch on fire. You keep it out there. And Cacus is another deity like this. Cacus was actually considered to be a very negative deity, a very destructive deity. And in the labors, of course, in the Greek, it's the labors of Heracles, Hera and Cleis, the glory of Hera. In the Roman, it's Hercules. And Hercules may be the name that we're a little more familiar with because, again, we tend to be more familiar with the Roman names. But one of Hercules' labors was to obtain the cattle of Geryon, and Cacus steals them, and Hercules ends up choking him to death. So Cacus eventually is extinguished. But then again, anybody who came in contact with Cacus was usually cooked and eaten. So the Romans were not necessarily unhappy about this result. Now here's an image from Pompeii of which we know is the city that, speaking of volcanoes and speaking of Vulcan, that got covered in the ash of Vesuvius along with Herculaneum. We have this image of the Penates and the Lares. These are representations of the household gods, and you see sort of the chthonic serpent underneath them, which shows the powers of the earth. Okay, so this shows their kind of natural representation. There's an interesting legend associated with them. Among other things, the Penates and Lares, the tradition of carrying the bride over the threshold after a wedding. This comes from, this comes from Rome. And it comes from the fact that when a girl in a family gets married, the household gods don't understand that she's getting married and going to another household. They get very, very offended. They think, oh, she doesn't like it here anymore. So the family does not want to end up being cursed, or their daughter to be cursed, or something bad to happen, because they assume that the girl just, isn't satisfied at home anymore. So what the groom would do was carry the bride over the threshold to make it appear she was being abducted. So therefore she was leaving the house against her will, and there was nothing she could do. So, the Penates and Lares couldn't hold anything against her, because obviously she didn't go of her own free will. Now, she is going of her own free will in theory. At least we hope she is. But that was where that tradition of carrying the bride over the threshold comes from, because you don't want to offend your household gods. And of course, bringing her in, and that's another way of introducing her to the new ones. Okay, and speaking of marriage and such things, let's go to fertility and fertility deities. Okay, so we have Saturn first. Saturn is an ancient god, okay? And again, we associate Saturn with Kronos. Sorry, I just hear beeping on my street. I don't know if the town is coming down to do something. Yeah, we have Saturn is, he's later identified with Kronos, but again, like Mars, that he has an agricultural component to him. Saturnalia ended up being a winter grain sowing festival, which was linked to the festival of Ops, another fertility deity associated with grain. And it ends up becoming a week-long December festival with a lot of drunkenness and a lot of acting out, and also the exchanging of gifts. So we can see that Saturnalia becomes sort of a forerunner to Christmas. So let me see what I have here in my notes on Saturn. Yeah, I want to get into that. I haven't forgotten about the religion thing. I'll get back to that. In ancient Roman religion and myth, Saturn, or Latin Saturnus, was a god of agriculture, liberation, and time. So that's what connects him to Kronos. His reign was depicted as a golden age of abundance and peace. He was a god of wealth. The temple of Saturn is in the Roman Forum, housed the state treasury. In December, he was celebrated. It was perhaps the most famous of the Roman festivals, the Saturnalia, a time of feasting, role reversals, free speech, gift giving, and revelry. We see some connection to the Dionysian rituals too. And as we've noted, Dionysus is very much akin to Jesus, who later replaces the Saturnalia festival with Christmas, right? So the planet Saturn and Saturday are both named after the god. Romans identified Saturn with Kronos, whose myths were adapted for Latin literature and Roman art. In particular, Kronos' role in the genealogy of Greek gods was transferred to Saturn. As early as Livius Andronicus, Jupiter was called the son of Saturn. Okay. The Roman Saturn had two consorts who represented different aspects of the god. The name of his wife, Ops, the Roman equivalent of Rhea, okay, means wealth, abundance, and resources. Earlier, his association with Lua, and I mentioned Lua unconscious here. Lua means destruction, dissolution, and loosening, a goddess who received the bloodied weapons of enemies destroyed in war. Under Saturn's rule, humans enjoyed the spontaneous bounty of the earth without labor in a state of social egalitarianism. The revelries of Saturnalia were supposed to reflect the conditions of the lost mythical age. Not all of them desirable, except as a temporary release from civilized constraint. The Greek equivalent was the chronia. According to Varro, who we've talked about, Saturn's name derived absatu from the word for sowing. Another of his epithets referred to the agricultural functions was sterculius, from stercus or manure. Agriculture was central to Roman identity, and Saturn was part of an archaic Roman religion. His name appears in the ancient hymn to the Salian priests, and his temple was the oldest known to have been recorded by the pontiffs. And incidentally, pontiff, we think of the Pope as the pontiff. Pontiff was a Roman priest, so we see where that comes from. It was located at the base of the Capitoline Hill, and a row of columns from the last rebuilding of the temple still stand. The position of Saturn's festival in the Roman calendar led to his association with concepts of time, especially the temporal transition of New Year. Macrobius, presents an interpretation of Saturnalia as a festival of light leading to the winter solstice. In Greek tradition, Kronos was conflated with time, and his devouring of his children is taken as an allegory for the passing of generations. The secular scythe of Father Time is a remnant of the agricultural implement of Kronos Saturn, and his aged appearance represents the waning old year with the birth of the new in antiquity, sometimes embodied as Aeon, which we talked about with the Orphics and creation myths. In late antiquity, Saturn is syncretized with a number of deities and begins to be depicted as winged, as is Kairos, timing or right time. Okay, so so we see this in relationship to Saturn. Now, Lua and Consus, okay, they're harvest deities that become associated with and become consorts. And as I mentioned, Lua was a goddess to whom sacrificed captured weapons, soldiers sacrificed captured weapons. And some people say it might just be an alternative name for ops. In ancient Roman religion, Consus was the protector of grains and storage bins, which among the Romans were subterranean silos, and was represented by a grain seed. The etymology of the name Consus is uncertain. It may be of Etruscan or Sabine origin. Sabines were the other group associated with the early Romans. In the allegorical etymology of antiquity, the name was related to the Latin verb conserere, or to sow, which is the title of the goddess Ops as Consivia or Consiva. The late Republican theologian Varro said that the Consalia was named for Consus. Okay, and the festival of Ops, who's supposed to be the wife of Saturn, was being held every August 25th and December 19th, timing of reaping and the seeding of crops. Okay, and Consus also became a god associated with secret conferences, as his name was also interpreted allegorically in relation to concilium, council or assembly. So they say Consus, like consensus, okay, the idea of being together. Okay, now, Dionysus and Kore are associated with Liber and Libera. And I don't have it in this particular thing, but what I like to do is I like to tell people Liber and Libera. Okay, so Dionysus, as we know, is the god of wine. Kore is an embodiment of Persephone. Okay, it's the Greek word, and Persephone in the Roman is Proserpina. They're associated with Liber and Libera. Now, the word Liber has to do with freedom, right? So the drinking of wine, it sets the tongue free. You know, in vino veritas. You know, in wine there is truth. So there's this idea of freedom, and then as you can see, and connected with the Saturnalia, there's this idea that you are liberated from social convention, that you are free. You are no longer bound to, you know, the authority of certain people, at least for temporarily speaking. And again, in the tradition of Rome, there's a very interesting book called Sexing the World, which I'll give you the citation for, where they talk about the way in which Romans take a concept, that a word that in Latin may be masculine or feminine in its native form, and create a feminine form. And here's one example. You have liber, the idea of freedom, and then they create libera, which is the feminine idea. Now, the feminine liber, or libera, has an association that it's something very familiar to us in the United States. And frequently I would ask students, I'd say, well, where have you seen Libera before? And they'll look at me. And then I like to show them a picture of the Statue of Liberty, because the Statue of Liberty is in fact a representation of the goddess Libera. Okay. So something, little fun fact, the Statue of Liberty is a representation of Libera, this goddess of freedom. And I also mentioned, since we're talking about livestock, we have the deity of livestock is known as Pallas. We also, well, we're going to talk about some of these other ones as well. Yeah, Pallas was a deity of shepherds, flocks, and livestock, regarded as male by some sources and female as others, even possibly as a pair of deities, as Pallas could be either singular or plural in Latin. Okay. And the festival was called the Parilia, celebrated on April 21st. Ooh, my mother's birthday, how about that? Cattle were driven through were bonfires on these days. And and then there was a festival related to the two Pallas, or Pallas Duobus, on July 7th. So as we can see, this very much harkens back to a worshiping of the forces of the world. Some of them obviously mythologically connect with the Greeks. Others have to do with fertility practices that were, or just practices that were meant for the good and the survival of the community, in terms of the pacts and the interactions, the sacrifices with the natural forces that were there. Okay, forest and garden deities. Okay, Silanus and Faunus were gods of the woods, and of course, Silva is the word for forest or woodland. Pennsylvania, if you're American, that's Penn's forest. Pennsylvania, has to do with the woods. And Faunus we think of as being, we think of a faun. So you're talking about someone who's kind of like the satyrs of the ancient Greek, you know, or the centaurs, which are half animal and half human and maybe have horns. So these are nature spirits or nature deities, nature elementals. Faunus is sometimes identified with Pan, which would make sense. They have the same hooved feet. And, oh, okay, sorry, that was PowerPoint 2019 doing its thing. And of course, again, back in the tradition of taking something masculine and making a feminized version, his consort was known as Fauna, identified with the deity, only worshipped by women, known as the Bona Dea, which means good goddess. Okay, just as Bonus Deus would be good god. And the forest deities are associated with Lupercalia. Now, Lupercalia in February is really the predecessor to Valentine's Day. And it's the festival of the she-wolf who supposedly suckled the founders of Rome. And we're going to talk about that and show pictures of that. Although the statue of Romulus and Remus suckling the wolf is hardly original. The babies were added afterwards, but we'll look at that. But Lupercalia, Luper is wolf. And Valentine's Day was because when we think about Valentine's Day in the Christian version, it's supposed to be a feast of Saint Valentine, okay, who was a martyr who was murdered in prison, and who was put to death, and supposedly it was Valentine's Day because they sent him all kinds of cards were sent to him and things. And we think about Valentine's Day when you send Valentines to people, right? But Lupercalia, we get the more romantic aspect of it, if you want to call it that, from Lupercalia, because Lupercalia was definitely a very highly sexualized festival associated with fertility. And this is where girls would go and get themselves caned on the backside and things like that. It was definitely a more sexualized kind of a thing then, and kind of how that way that kind of morphed with Saint Valentine is weird, but it's really a carryover of this Roman festival of Lupercalia. And then, of course, you have Venus, the goddess. We're going to talk specially about her, and because again, even though she's technically considered to be a counterpart to Aphrodite, there are some other differences. And Priapus, who we've talked about, Priapus, who is pictured with his dick being like this big. Yeah, they're definitely, you can see how these are considered are representations of elemental kinds of deities, how they represent that. Either by having half human and half animal kind of a body, or by just having other characteristics that show that they deal with the fertility of the land. Okay, water deities. Tiberinus, okay, the Tiber River. So this is a water god, and the importance of that river propitiated each May. You might compare it to the way that the Ganges in India is actually worshipped as a deity and is treated as a sacred river as such. And so Tiberinus has this kind of a festival. I'm just going to look at my notes here. Yeah, he was added to the 3,000 rivers, sons of Oceanus and Tethys, as the genius or genius of the river Tiber. According to the Aeneid, he helped Aeneas in his travel from Troy, suggesting to him that he land in Latium, see the founding, and gave him much other precious advice. With Monto, Tiberinus was also the father of Ocnus. He's also known as a river god who found the twins Romulus and Remus and gave them to the she-wolf Lupa, who had just lost her own cubs to suckle. He later rescued and married Rhea Silvia, the mother of the twins and a Vestal virgin who had been sentenced to death. Yes, as I mentioned about the Vestal virgins, I think I mentioned it in I think in the 12 Olympians, I talked about how priestesses appointed that position who ended up pregnant would probably be buried alive. But this did not happen in her case, because supposedly, this may be the reason that they claimed to have sex. No, it was the god who came on me. I didn't have sex with anyone. So it's divine child, then that's a whole different thing. Okay, so Neptunus, or Neptune, is identified with Poseidon. That's pretty straightforward. I don't need to go into a lot of explanation, but he was originally a freshwater deity. And that's actually not too surprising, because Poseidon, what was his gift to Athens was freshwater, a freshwater spring. So Poseidon does tend to be associated with those underground freshwater springs. So it's not surprising that Neptune has that, that's how they got connected to Neptune. Portunus, the god of gates and harbors. We do talk about Portunus in the liminal class. His festival is August 17th, the 17th day before the calends of September. Was the Portumnalia, a minor occasion in the Roman year. On this day, keys were thrown into a fire for good luck, because he has to do with the keys. See, he's different from Janus, even though he's two-faced, also like Janus. He's different because Portunus has to do with gates and harbors specifically, and the word portal comes from, or you know, and even porch. I mean, these are words that come from Portunus, you know, or port, like a harbor or a port where a ship would come in, because he's more associated with those places where ships are, or the keys to the city, or things like that. He has to do with an opening of doors. And here it says, Portunus appears to be related to Janus, with whom he shares many characters, functions, and symbols of the key. He too was represented as two-headed, with each head facing in opposite directions on coins and figurehead of ships. He was considered Deus portuum et portarumque praeses. Okay, he's the gods of you know, of ports and gateways, with the opening of ports and gateways. The relationship between the two gods is underlined by the fact that the date chosen for the dedication of the rebuild of the Temple Janus in the Forum Holitorium by Emperor Tiberius is August 17th. So there's a connection between the two. But you know, but they do serve slightly different functions. But again, they have to do with that dual nature of walking through the door, leaving something behind and entering into something new. Juturna, or Juturna, is the nymph associated with springs, and she is portrayed as the sister of Turnus in the Aeneid. And we'll see her relationship. She kind of plays a little minor role towards the end of the Aeneid, but we'll talk about that. Says that, yeah, sister of Turnus supported him against Aeneas by giving him his sword after he dropped it in battle, as well as taking him away from the battle when it seemed he would get killed. Jupiter turned her into a water nymph and gave her a sacred well, Lavinium Latium, as well as another one near the Temple of Vesta in the Forum Romanum. Okay, so there's that connection. The pool next to the second well was called Lacus Juturnae. Juturnae had an affair with Jupiter, but the secret was betrayed by another nymph, Larunda, whom Jupiter struck with muteness as a punishment. And finally, we have Camenae, a water nymph. These are ones that are specifically mentioned in literature. They were goddesses of childbirth and fountains, and also prophetic deities. There were 4 of them. They're often identified with the muses. There's more than 4 muses, but they were Carmenta, Ageria, Antivorta, and Postverta. Okay, and the last 2 were sometimes specifically referred to as the Carmentae, and in ancient times might have had aspects, 2 aspects of Carmenta rather than separate figures. In later times, however, they are distinct beings believed to protect women in labor. And you can see the relationship between water and labor, because one breaks their water when they're giving birth to a child. So again, you see with we're focusing on the elemental aspects of this. So you can see where, even though, again, I'm just reiterating, even though you've identified, you know, you're identifying some of your major gods with the Greek system, in terms of the mythology, you're still seeing the importance of the local nature spirits here, which we now think of, again, go back to the liminal episode class, where we refer to the liminal nature of these kinds of fairy type spirits, which is what you might think of these as. Okay, so let's talk about Diana and Mercury, who would be associated with, Diana is associated with Artemis or Hecate, particularly with Artemis, because they're both hunters. Hecate, though, as I've mentioned, is she's sort of the Artemis of the underworld. They both run with packs. They're both associated with crossroads, although one is in the upper world and one's in the lower world. And, you know, so they're both running with their baying dogs, so, or polecats or whatever in terms of Hecate. So there's definitely a hunting, there's that running with the dogs aspect of both of them. And, and Diana here is also a, not only goddess of the hunt, but the goddess of the moon also. So you have this connection here. Let's see what else I have here on that. Yeah. The most celebrated place of worship for Diana was a sacred grove beside Lake Nemi at Aricia near Rome. Associated with Diana at this shrine was the Roman hero Viribus, or Viribus. Sorry, I'm saying it wrong. Virbius. I'm adding an extra I. According to the myth, he was Diana's first high priest at Aricia. All the priests who followed had to obtain the position by winning a fight to the death with the current high priest. The new high priest would keep his position in turn until he was conquered in combat. Rather strong. To win the right to fight the high priest, a challenger had to break off a large branch of a sacred oak tree in the grove at Lake Nemi. Now that's interesting because that's almost related to the idea of the golden bough that Aeneas has to bring to Persephone to show that he has the right to enter the underworld. In this case, you have a bough that you have to present to show that you deserve to be priest of high priest of Diana. Now, Virbius is equated to Hippolytus in the Greek. Hippolytus is the son of Theseus, who was killed after Phaedra claims that he has raped her. And of course, he is very chaste. He's a follower of Artemis. So when she actually comes on to him, and when he refuses her, she goes to the father and claims that. So the father has him dragged to his death. Interestingly, I use this as an example of how even if you are devoted to the gods are not going to save you. It's not their role, because he also insulted Aphrodite, which is how he ended up this way. Then Hippolytus, the way that Artemis does reward him is she turns him into a god and gives him a cult after his death. So Virbius ends up becoming equated with Hippolytus. Okay. Now, the Diana cult is so established in Rome by Servius Tullius, who was another one of the Roman kings, and her priest. And then the priest, though, usually was a fugitive slave, the Rex Nemorensis, named after Nemi, the wood that's there at Aricia. And so I mentioned Hippolytus. Now, Mercury, again, is equated with Hermes and Rome's chief god of commerce and trading. That's his main role there, because Rome is a great center of commerce. And again, similar to Hermes, wears winged sandals, god of trades, merchants, and travels, the son of Maia, Maestas, which is, again, the carryover from the Greek, and of Jupiter. And that this is also true in Greek. His name is related to the Latin word merx, for merchandise, compare merchandise, or merchant commerce, merc. Mercari, to trade, and mercus, wages. His earliest forms he appears to have related to the Etruscan deity Turms, but most of his characteristics were borrowed from Hermes. Latin writers rewrote Hermes' myth and substituted his name with that of Mercury. However, there are at least two myths that involve Mercury that are Roman in origin. In Virgil's Aeneid, Mercury reminds Aeneas of his mission to found the city of Rome. In Ovid's Fasti, Mercury is assigned to escort the nymph Larunda to the underworld. And supposedly, this is interesting. Larunda, he fell in love with Larunda and made love to her on the way. This act has also been interpreted as a rape. Larunda, therefore, became mother to two children referred to as the Lares, the invisible household gods. So the household gods are supposed to be Mercury and Larunda, as we know, who was in trouble for ratting on Zeus for sleeping with Tertuna. Okay, so their death and underworld beliefs. Obviously, this is of special interest to me. So the parentalia, interesting, the word parent here, which corresponds also with the Lupercalia on the 14th, runs from the February 13th to the 21st. Now, the Romans very much respected their dead, but like the fire gods, they wanted them far away. They celebrated these festivals, they dug these sort of trenches for the offerings, and they were on the outside of the city. Just like they didn't want like anything catching fire, they did not want ghosts and dead people wandering through their city. So, they worried about, obviously the Feast of the Dead, you want to respect your ancestors and you want to show them that respect, but you don't want them coming back to visit after they're dead. So they try to calm the angry dead. There's also words, there's the term lemurs or the manas. Manas is like the kindly ones. It's kind of in the way that we talk about the Furies as being the Eumenides or the kindly ones. It's a way, it's like saying, you know, nice doggy, don't bite me. And these are the spirits that could potentially harm the household. Their festival days were considered very inauspicious. And Lemuria was celebrated in May. I'm wondering if I have a copy of the, I'm just looking through my notes here. I don't seem to have it handy, but there is a passage in one of Ovid's works, and if I need to remember to share that with you, where there's an actual ritual that the head of the family would go through on Lemuria to keep the ghosts out of the house. It's a rather interesting one. I believe it has to do with beans, with putting beans out and putting them, a certain number of them in a certain position, and then each time the father does it, like at midnight, to recite a certain thing. It kind of reminds us almost of like reciting Bloody Mary in the mirror or something, except this is meant to keep the ghosts away, not to let them in. So yeah, just kind of like in ancient Greece, you know, the relationship to the dead was kind of like that sort of fearful respect. Yeah, and the underworld in Roman literature was called Orcus, or it might be called Inferni, and also Pluto. Okay, because Pluto becomes the equivalent of Hades, and of course Dis, and Dis is another name for it too. This is the name you actually see in Dante's Inferno for the underworld. It refers to the main city of hell as the city of Dis, and Dis Pater, of course, is father of the underworld, I guess you could say. But the equivalent of Hades was Pluto. One has to remember too that the term Pluto is related to the term Pluton, which has to do with wealth. So what's under the earth is not only hell, well, actually, by the time you get to the Aeneid, you've got a lot of Platonic influence on the underworld. So there is kind of this idea of the underworld as hell, in a way, in a sense that, I mean, there's still this kind of concept of like the equivalent of the Elysian fields, where the good dead go, or the honorable dead, or those who are children of demigods or whatever. But there's also this idea of their equivalent of the Furies punishing sinful people, or people who have committed great wrongs in Tartarus. And there's an emphasis on that in the Aeneid that you do not see in the Odyssey in the similar scene. Okay, so the underworld has a different inflection to it. Even though it's very similar to the Greek underworld, you're getting more towards this idea of the place under the earth as a place of punishment, which again was not the original idea. And then of course we talk about Libitina, who's the goddess of burial. There's also festivals associated with her as well. Now let me take a moment here, because I have not talked about the Roman, the priesthood and the rituals. I just want to find my notes on that. I have a bunch of notes here, and I know that I'm putting some on top here that don't belong. Okay, yeah, here we go. These are the notes I'm looking for. Okay. And a lot of these are from Georges Dumézil in his book on ancient Roman and Etruscan religion. It's 2-volume set. It's actually a really good one. I'll try to provide the citation for it. I don't know how readily available it is now. I have it in the library where I work, but there are the copies. Okay, so they were. It stressed the importance of the tripartite plan of the Regia, the cultic center of Rome. So we talked about the triads, the archaic triad and the Capitoline triad. So the three, a triad. And the official residence of the Rex, or the king. As recorded by sources and confirmed by archaeological data, it was devised to lodge the three major deities of Jupiter, Mars, and either Ops or Quirinus, the deity of agricultural plenty, in 3 separate rooms. The cult of Fides involved 3 Flaminis Maiores, which are high priests. They were carried to the sacellum of the deity together in a covered carriage and officiated with their right hand wrapped to the fingers in a piece of white cloth. The association with the deity that founded divine order, Fides is associated with Iupiter, or Jupiter, and the functions of guardian of the supreme judicial order, underlies the mutual interconnections among them and among the gods they represented with the supreme heavenly order. whose arcane character was represented symbolically in the hidden character of the forms of the cult. The spolia opima was dedicated to the person who had killed the king or the chief of the enemy in battle. They were dedicated to Jupiter, and in the case Rome was the king or equivalent. Okay. Dumézil also analyzed the cultural functions of the Flamen Quirinalis, Quirinus, to better understand the characters of this deity. One element was his officiating of the Fierae of the Concilia Estivia, the festival of summer, which associated Quirinus to the cult of Consus and that of Ops. And then he talks about all the different ones that they associated with. I don't want to go too heavy into that. Okay, so this is Dumézil's characteristic of that. I'm just trying to look. I thought I had some more notes on the priesthood there. I guess the one thing I want you to take away in terms of the Roman priesthood is that they had very, very specific functions, like very specific things that they could wear, very specific foods that they could eat on certain days, and very specific rituals that they had to carry out throughout the day, which is not necessarily a common, I mean, even though, yes, obviously people who were in the equivalent of clergy or priesthood had certain, functions that they performed, it was very, very highly ritualized and very, very regimented in Rome, which is keeping with kind of the military characteristic of the nation. And so there's a tremendous amount from the Christian priesthood in terms of their practices or the practices of monks or in certain orders that carries over from these Roman practices. So that's kind of an entirely different discussion, but I wanted to at least mention it here because everything was very, very precise, because everything had to be carried out precisely in order to sort of preserve the integrity or the situation of the city itself. So it's very interesting. I do talk a little bit about it in my book, Death and the Maiden. When I talk about the Romans, I do go into that into some detail. I don't want to get too sidetracked with it here, but I at least wanted to mention that, you know, you have all of these different hierarchies of priests and of clergy, and they all have very, very specific functions that they must fulfill for everything to go correctly. Okay, and that is a very highly Roman concept, although you also do see similar ideas in Judaism when they're for their own priesthood at a time. Now we have sort of the rabbis, the teachers, but when you had the idea of a Jewish high priesthood, it was very, very similar in function, which is why I've said that's why you could see the Romans adopting that aspect of Judaism. Probably made a great deal of sense to them. Okay. Okay, so we'll talk briefly about the household gods. I mentioned them earlier, the Lares and household spirits who bring prosperity to the family, and we just talked about the relationship between Mercury and La Runda, who supposedly brought about the birth of the Lares. And the Lares Prestites, the deities that are specific to a household or family, because obviously, again, we're talking about a religion and a mythology that is loaded with spirits, which again is very, very normal for the ancient world. It's not until later on when we have this idea of one God, which is actually kind of weird in a lot of places. The multiplicity of gods represents the multiplicity of forces that we deal with, and not all of them are necessarily as kind or as, you know, they all have different requirements. So the idea is to learn what those requirements are. I'm also going to mention that the Etruscans, who are at least some of the forerunners of the Romans, were very much big on augury and divination. They have an entire, Dumézil has an entire interpretation of Etruscan divination practices, which is fascinating, especially augury, which is the divination of birds, you know, watching patterns of birds and or killing birds and looking for certain things, maybe in their entrails. But augury, you know, this kind of interpreting of signs, this is how you know what the gods of nature want from you. You look at nature and you look at what's being indicated and you say, oh, that bird flew this way, it means this. We still do things like that. It's a way of looking for patterns and dealing with uncertainties. Now we just do it through the sciences and through testing and things. And you may say, well, hey, that's a lot more reliable. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes, think about the Jungian idea of synchronicity. There's the idea that sometimes these meaningful coincidences are meant to kind of point something out to us that maybe we're missing. And it's our own instincts or our intuition that's trying to point that out. And we've been kind of conditioned in this, not kind of, we are conditioned in this world to think that our rationality is the only tool that's of any use. And that is not always the case. Although we have to be careful of looking for patterns that aren't there. But I don't want to sidetrack on that. It just suffice to say that you see here that we're dealing with a multiplicity of spirits. There are protectors. The household gods will also protect travelers. They will protect farms. And then you have a spirit that is part of your creative power. It's almost like your consciousness, the thing that allows you to make art, to make music, to make unique things, technological things. And that's the lectus genialis. The genius, or the genius, is the power of creative spirit. The genius associated with the phallus, in particular, is known as the lectus genialis. Okay, so the creative power, the power to create children, has a specific association. St. Augustine talks a little bit about that when you look at his writings. I mean, normally it's because he's disdainful of Roman practices, but he does talk. It's from Augustine's writings that we actually learn a tremendous amount about what the Romans believed about household gods and marriage and that sort of thing. So that's something else I should probably cite for you. Okay, and some other non-Roman deities that are here in Rome. Hercules, of course. He is the only hero cult that's accepted at the founding of Rome. When Numa makes the decision, Hercules is considered to have very great importance, probably because of his strength and his bravery and his courage and might. These are all Roman values, so Hercules would be very important. The Dioscuri. These supposedly appeared before the Romans in battle against the Latins and led the Romans to victory. Okay, now the Dioscuri are the Gemini. They're Castor and Pollux in the Roman, and they have a Castor and Polydeucus, I think, in the Greek. But they are, one is mortal, one's immortal. They're both children of Zeus, or one is a child of Zeus and the other isn't. But because they're twins, they were kind of born at the same time. They eventually they kind of gain a divine status. So in other words, one has to go to the underworld one day, and the other one's still alive, and then they switch off after they died. It is kind of this whole mythology of the Dioscuri, but they are associated with Gemini, okay, in the constellation of Gemini, twins. And supposedly, again, they supposedly appeared before the Romans, and we have these omens and oracles again against the Latins, and supposedly led the Romans to victory. Okay. Now the Sibyls. The Sibyls are an interesting group. Sibyls are like the sort of witches or prophetesses. I mean, there was a Sibyl, the Pythia, for example, in the Temple of Apollo. You have these women who prophesize. And there was certainly a Sibyl of Cumae that appears in the Aeneid, which we'll talk about. But she, there was a Sibyl who had sold books of prophecy to the last Roman king, Tarquinius Superbus. Okay, he ended up being deposed, and then the Republic was put in place. And the story goes that she had offered him, I'm trying to see if I have notes on it, how many books it was. I forget the exact number. I don't seem to have it handy, but it was like she had offered him something like 10 books. It was a lot. It was a large number, and he refused. And then, the number went down and down. The price got higher, and the number of books got lower. So eventually, I think they had 2 or 3 books that he eventually did buy, which are supposed to prophesize the entire future of Rome, and gave instructions as to say which gods needed to be propitiated the most in order for the city to survive. And these were known as the Sibylline oracles. And they were kept in a special part of the temple, Capitoline temple there. Although supposedly at one point during the Christianization of this, there was one of the emperors had a general go in and destroy them. So they did disappear at one point. But supposedly they had all the prophecies about the entire future of Rome. So, I mean, again, whether these books really existed, whether they were a myth, whether anything in them was worthwhile, we don't know. It's too bad. It'd be kind of fun to know what they said. There might be actually some transcriptions. There are actually, I think actually there are now. I'm not. There are some transcriptions that talk about what some of the oracles actually were. going to see if I can locate some of those to share, because you know, they're rather interesting about how they turn up. But certainly the oracles mention Apollo Asclepius, who is the god of healing and medicine, and Cybele, who is the ancient Phoenician goddess, actually, a Phoenician mother goddess, who we talked about in the Mother Goddess lecture. They were all worshipped in Rome as on the advice of the Sibylline oracles. Now, you have to remember that these Sibylline oracles came at a time, you know, just before the Republic, just before the Punic Wars. So once these deities, you know, once they were introduced to these deities, they end up becoming of great importance within Rome. The Cybele cult certainly was huge in Rome. And in fact, there's Young points to parts of the book of Revelation, for example, the eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven, that are really a reference to the Cybele cult. Okay, and yeah, so you see it evident in the early Roman Empire. But as I have mentioned, the Cybele cult's very, very violent and very bloody. So it's a mother goddess cult, but you know, castration is one of its key components. So, and Asclepius, he's actually a Greek god. Well, this is, again, these were the Greek, either the Greek or foreign deities that were accepted. And just to tell you a little about Asclepius, he's the god of medicine in ancient Greece, the healing aspect of the medical arts. His daughters are Hygeia, which is where the word hygiene comes from, and Iaso, the goddess of recuperation, Esco, the goddess of the healing process, and Iglia, who's the goddess of beauty, splendor, magnificence, and adornment. And really, I think at least one version of the story of Asclepius says that he was a, he was a mortal who had figured out how to live forever. And so Zeus was like, oh, we're not going to have any of that. So struck him down. So he ends up going into the underworld. But once he goes to the underworld, he achieves the status of a deity, because he's, you know, able to heal. And his serpent entwined staff is the one that we actually see associated with the medical profession. So yeah, healing. Apollo has to obviously do with civilization and culture, but of course we also know Apollo's a big bully, which kind of fits with the Roman idea. And Cybele's a little bit intense for them. That's kind of an interesting choice, but you know, perhaps in a way that I think of Chthoniya and the stuff I talk about in Chthoniya, you know, maybe there's an awareness there of the way that root violent feminine power is actually part of what brings might to a nation and makes them successful in war. So just a thought. Okay, Romulus and Remus, let's talk about them. They're twin sons of Rhea Silvia and either Mars or Hercules. Now, as I've mentioned, Rhea Silvia is supposed to be a Vestal virgin, and supposedly she ends up pregnant. Again, usually in this version it's by Mars. So she somehow escapes being killed. Like somehow her story is either believed, or actually, you know, it is, I think she produces some kind of evidence that she is that the child is divine, and that she has not broken her vows, so she is allowed to live. But the children were left to die by their uncle, the king of Alba Longa, and you know, Alba Longa being the city founded by Aeneas, and so they end up being saved again by the Tiberias River brings them to a she-wolf, who then rescues and raises them. And this is also part of the hero myth, as we know. It's the idea of the hero who you know, is a threat to either the uncle or the father, or to somebody who's in power, some, you know, wicked uncle or father who tries to get rid of them. And then they are raised in a pastoral setting. Yeah, and Amulius is the name of the king, their uncle. And then they come back and they claim their rightful inheritance, right? So they come back to do that, and they grow up, they come back, they attack their uncle, they slay him, they are now the conquerors. But then there's augury. Again, there's a prophecy about where the city should be founded, and they argue about it. And you know, Remus thinks it should be in one place, Romulus thinks it should be in another. So Romulus ends up killing his brother Remus, and so he ends up founding Rome where he thinks it should be founded. And Romulus, of course, comes from Rome. And here's the statue. The statue's at the Vatican. of the she-wolf that supposedly suckles the babies, although the statue itself is apparently much older than the two babies underneath it. They were added at a later time. Nonetheless, the whole construct is still pretty old. Definitely much later than the founding of Rome, but this is meant to represent the she-wolf, the Lupercalia she-wolf, who is supposed to be, I want to say that the one statue, I want to say one's Middle Ages and one is Renaissance, but I'm not 100% correct about that, so don't quote me. I'd have to go back and look it up. It may be worth going back and looking if you're interested in the art history of this piece. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about Aeneas, because we're going to get into the Aeneid. He's the quote-unquote founder of Alba Longa, which is what Latium or Lavinium used to be called. Actually, Alba Longa was called Lavinium, which is in the Latium region of Italy. And the Aeneid talks about his coming to Latium. And again, there's a lot of prophecy in the Aeneid. So the king says, you're that foreign man who's supposed to come marry my daughter. But of course, his daughter was already engaged to somebody else. So there's a bit of a problem there. And thus leads to a war. But Aeneas wins in the end, and then he marries Lavinia, the daughter. And the Lavinium, the Etruscan city, is founded there. And the Lavinium eventually becomes Alba Longa. Okay. And so supposedly Aeneas later dies in a battle with the neighboring Latins, and his descendants in Lavinium. Okay, well, this says his descendants found Alba Longa. So it's Lavinium. It becomes Alba Longa. I didn't get that wrong. Okay. I don't want to confuse myself here. And his later descendants end up founding Rome. So Romulus and Remus are actually descendants of Aeneas, according to this, because Aeneas is now the mythological founder. Just in the way that you see in Herodotus and the others that some of the ancient demigod heroes are, the progenitors of the, different kings, or tribal kings within Greece. So it kind of adds to their credibility. And so the Aeneid itself was written by Virgil as a national Roman epic, as I said, similar to the Iliad and Odyssey, but it definitely has a different inflection. It has a very different attitude towards war than the other one. And it makes sense because at that point, Rome was going into the period of empire, and they were more interested in peace than they were in war. So, and then there's the legend of the Roman kings. Once Rome was established, first is the battle between the Romans and the Sabines. This one's interesting, and I do talk about this one in my book, which is supposedly ended by the Sabine women themselves. And so what supposedly happens is that when the Romans come, they actually integrate in a way that's nonviolent. They actually marry the Sabine women who are willing to marry them. But their families, the males in the families, believe that the women were raped or abducted, so they're ready to start a war. But the Sabine women come out and they say, what are you going to do? Are you going to kill your own children? Or are you going to do, And they say, no, we went of our own choice. Don't attack them. We are all brethren now. So they sort of bring everybody together without a war, which again, that kind of fits into, it's funny because for such a warlike people as the Romans are, they have this tradition of trying to make peace and not war. Okay, so it's really, really interesting, almost paradox there, because when we know what the Romans are known for. Okay, so they unite with the Sabines. The Sabines and the Etruscans are kind of considered to be connected with these people of Aeneas, if you will, from Alba Longa. And Romulus himself ruled jointly with the Sabine king, Titus Tabius, until his death. So there was a spirit of cooperation there. And 6 other kings are mentioned as kings of Rome in Livy's annals. And that's Numa Pompilius, who is the one who supposedly gets all the proper religious rites and rituals from Jupiter himself for the empire. Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Tarquinius Priscius. This sounds like a Monty Python sketch, doesn't it? Servius Tullius and Tarquinius Superbus. And the last king is eventually sent. He's not killed, he's sent into exile by the people who are now dissatisfied at this point, and then Rome becomes a republic after that. And they remain a republic until, you sort of have that first triumvirate of Caesar, Caesar, oh God, which one was the first one? Octavian's the second one. I'll say Caesar, Pompey, and God, it's terrible. I'm forgetting my Roman history at this point. I have to look that up. But you have a first triumvirate, and Caesar himself is looking to become a dictator at this point. And then Caesar, of course, is killed by Brutus. And conspired against, and it's Octavian, another member of what they call the Iulius family, who you will see mentioned in the Aeneid. Iulius is Julius, and Caesar means king, or it's another word for the German word Kaiser comes from that as well. It's the idea of one who's a king or has a royal thing. But the Iulius house was a patrician family. Patricians being the ruling class of Rome. You had the patricians and the plebeians, and the patricians were the ones who were in the Roman Senate and had all of the power, and the plebeians were just well, we still use the term. We've heard so many people as plebs. They're the hoi polloi, the day-to-day regular people who don't have big important government roles or whatever. That was kind of the idea. Okay, so that's it on Rome for now. This is just really a brief overview. There's other things I could get into a lot more depth on. My book certainly has a lot more depth on some aspects of this if you're interested. But I will provide you with as many links as I can, or at least a bibliography. I can stop the share at this point. And so that's pretty much what I'm just going to say about Rome. It's just a general overview, and certainly you can touch base with me if you have specific questions. So till the next